Sometimes the difference between dying and surviving is whether one stranger decides to stop walking. Leipzig, April 1945. Rain drifted through the shattered streets like cold smoke, settling over piles of broken brick and windows without glass. The war was ending, but the city did not look liberated. It looked hollowed out. Buildings leaned against each other like exhausted old men. Storefront signs swung slowly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang across the wet morning air, thin and uncertain. A line of civilians stretched around the corner of what had once been a bakery on Königstrasse. Men in worn coats, women wrapped in blankets, children clutching tin cups against their chests. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Hunger had made the entire city quiet. Clara Weiss stood near the back of the line, her hands buried inside the sleeves of a coat that no longer kept out the cold. She was 26 years old, though the war had stolen enough weight and sleep from her face to make her appear older. Rain darkened strands of blonde hair against her cheeks. Her shoes were 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper to keep her feet dry. In her right hand, hidden beneath the coat sleeve, she held a silver pocket watch with a cracked glass face. Her father's watch, the only thing she had not traded for food. The line moved 3 steps in 20 minutes. Somewhere ahead, a woman began coughing so hard she had to sit on the curb. Nobody reacted anymore. People were too tired for surprise. Clara stared through the fogged bakery window at shelves that looked almost empty. 1 loaf remained near the register. Just one. The smell reached the street every time the door opened. Warm bread, yeast, flour, real food. Her stomach tightened so sharply she pressed a hand against it. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. Half a boiled potato. That was all. A truck rattled down the avenue, tires splashing through puddles. American soldiers sat in the back beneath olive canvas tarps, their helmets wet with rain. Most civilians kept their eyes lowered as the truck passed. Clara did the same. The war had taught people not to be noticed. But the smell from the bakery drifted stronger as the door opened again, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. Clara felt her knees weaken. The line blurred into gray shapes and rainwater. She heard someone mutter something behind her, but the words sounded far away. The pocket watch slipped from her fingers first. Then she fell. Her shoulder struck the wet pavement hard enough to send pain through her arm, but she barely felt it. All she could see was the watch lying inches away in a puddle, its cracked face staring upward into the rain. Nobody moved immediately. People in starving cities learn not to stop for every collapse. Then boots approached through the water. Heavy American boots. Clara heard them before she saw them. One pair slowed while the others kept walking. For a second, there was only rain tapping softly against broken stone. Then a man's voice, low and calm, cut through the cold air. "Easy now," he said. "Don't try to stand yet." Clara opened her eyes slowly. An American soldier crouched beside her, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. Mid-30s maybe, broad shoulders beneath a soaked field jacket, mud on his sleeves. His gloves were dark leather, worn pale around the fingers. He picked up the silver pocket watch carefully, wiping rainwater from the cracked glass with his thumb before placing it gently into her shaking hand. He did not look at her like an enemy. He looked at her like someone who had simply fallen down in the rain. And somehow, that frightened her more than hatred ever could. The soldier glanced toward the bread line, then back at Clara as rainwater gathered along the edge of the street. People had already turned their attention away again. In Leipzig that spring, survival demanded a certain cruelty of focus. If every starving person became your concern, you would never keep moving. But this American remained crouched beside her, one knee pressed into the wet pavement as though time had slowed around him alone. Clara pushed herself upright carefully, embarrassed by how weak her arms felt. Her fingers tightened around the silver watch. The cracked glass was cold against her palm. "I am fine," she said automatically in rough English. The words came from instinct, the same instinct civilians used with occupying soldiers everywhere. Do not become a problem. Do not invite attention. The soldier studied her face for a moment without answering. His eyes were gray beneath the rain-dark helmet brim, tired in the way all soldiers looked tired by 1945. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket and pulled out a small cloth bundle wrapped in wax paper. Clara stared at it without understanding. The smell reached her first. Bread. Real bread. Not potato flour mixed with sawdust. not stale crusts traded on black market corners. Fresh bread, warm enough that steam still lingered beneath the paper wrapping. Her stomach tightened painfully. "Take it," the soldier said quietly. Clara did not move. Every lesson from the last 6 years told her to be careful. Nothing came freely anymore. Not food. Not kindness. Not safety. The soldier seemed to recognize the hesitation immediately. He unwrapped the bundle halfway and tore off a small piece himself. Butter glistened faintly across the surface before he ate it. Then he handed the rest toward her again. "Safe," he said, the same word people used with frightened animals. Rain tapped softly against the broken trolley tracks nearby. Clara accepted the bread with trembling fingers. It felt heavier than she expected. Warmth spread slowly into her palms. For one terrible second, she nearly cried just from holding it. She lowered her eyes quickly before he could notice. Around them, the line outside the bakery continued inching forward. Nobody spoke. Somewhere farther down the avenue, an engine backfired sharply, followed by the distant sound of church bells rolling through wet air. Clara broke off the smallest possible bite and placed it carefully into her mouth. Butter, salt, soft bread that almost dissolved against her tongue. Her knees weakened again, though this time she remained standing. The soldier watched quietly as she chewed. He did not rush her, did not ask questions, did not lecture her about the war or Germany or blame. He simply stood there beneath the rain while she ate like someone remembering how food worked. "Name?" he finally asked after a long silence. Clara swallowed slowly. "Clara Weiss." He nodded once. "Sergeant Daniel Harper." His accent carried the long vowels of somewhere southern or western. American in a way the old propaganda broadcasts had never captured correctly. Not sharp or savage. Just tired. A military truck rolled past the intersection behind him, splashing muddy water across the street. One of the soldiers in the back shouted something Daniel ignored completely. His attention remained on Clara. She noticed then that his gloves were worn thin near the fingertips, the leather faded pale from use. This was not a polished officer from the newsreels. This was a man who had been sleeping outdoors for too many months. Clara finished the last bite too quickly despite trying not to. Shame flickered across her face immediately afterward. Daniel noticed that too. Without a word, he reached into his jacket again and removed a second item. A chocolate ration wrapped in dark paper. Clara stared at it as though it belonged to another lifetime. Daniel placed it carefully into her hand beside the silver watch. "Eat slowly this time," he said softly. "Your body is not ready for a feast yet." Clara stood beneath the broken awning outside the bakery long after the rain began to slow. Water dripped steadily from bent metal gutters overhead, splashing into puddles blackened by soot and ash. Around her, the line finally dissolved when the last loaf inside was sold. People walked away silently, shoulders lowered against the cold morning wind. Nobody protested anymore when food ran out. Protest required energy. Daniel adjusted the strap of his rifle across his shoulder and glanced toward the intersection where military trucks moved slowly through the city. The occupation had turned Leipzig into a place of checkpoints and paper forms. Everywhere, soldiers carried clipboards instead of weapons raised in anger. The war itself felt finished. What remained was exhaustion. Clara still held the chocolate ration unopened in one hand. Her fingers traced the edges of the wrapper carefully, almost afraid it would disappear if she moved too quickly. Daniel noticed. "You can eat it later," he said. "Too much sugar. All at once will make you sick." Clara looked at him with quiet suspicion. "How do you know this?" Daniel gave the smallest shrug. "Oklahoma, during the Depression. Saw hungry people plenty of times growing up." The word Oklahoma meant nothing to her except distance. Somewhere beyond oceans and maps, and everything war had destroyed. Daniel glanced at the silver watch still resting in her palm. "Your father's?" Clara nodded once. "He repaired watches before the war." Her voice softened around the memory. "Small shop near the river." Daniel looked down the street where shattered buildings faded into gray rain. "Guessing the shop is gone now." Clara did not answer immediately. Wind carried the smell of wet brick and coal smoke through the avenue. Finally, she said, "Everything is gone now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere nearby, an American radio crackled faint jazz music from inside a parked supply truck. The sound drifted strangely through the ruined city, cheerful in a way that almost felt disrespectful. Then Clara noticed movement across the street. Two German women stood beneath a damaged pharmacy sign, watching her carefully. One of them whispered something to the other while glancing toward Daniel. Clara recognized the expression immediately. Curiosity mixed with caution. An American soldier speaking quietly with a German woman alone in the street invited attention now. Rumors traveled faster than trains in starving cities. Clara lowered her eyes at once. "I should go," she murmured. Daniel followed her gaze toward the women across the street, but seemed unconcerned. "You got somewhere to stay?" Clara hesitated. "An old rail station near Lindenau." Daniel frowned slightly. "You sleeping there?" "Many people are." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but stopped himself. A military jeep rolled around the corner then, tires crunching broken glass along the curb. An American corporal leaned out the passenger side. "Harper," he shouted. "Captain wants everybody back at the square in 10. Daniel lifted a hand in acknowledgement without taking his eyes off Clara. The jeep continued down the avenue. Clara stepped backward instinctively. The distance between civilian and soldier returned all at once, cold and formal. Daniel reached into his jacket one final time and removed a small folded piece of paper stamped with blue military ink. A ration ticket. Clara stared at it in disbelief. "Mess station on Johannisplatz," he said. "Soup line opens at 6 tonight. Show them this." Clara did not take it immediately. "Why?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at her for a long second beneath the pale gray sky. Rainwater slid from the edge of his helmet onto the shoulders of his coat. "Because starving people stop looking human after a while," he said. "And I think somebody should help before that happens." Then he placed the ticket gently into her hand beside the chocolate and the silver watch before turning toward the waiting trucks at the end of the street. Clara watched him walk away through the rain until the gray of his uniform disappeared into the ruined city like smoke. By evening the rain had stopped, leaving Leipzig wrapped in damp gray mist that clung to shattered rooftops and empty trolley lines. Clara crossed the city slowly with the ration ticket hidden inside her coat pocket beside the silver watch. The streets smelled of wet brick, coal smoke, and standing water. Every few blocks, she passed civilians gathered around small fires built from broken furniture and splintered doors. Nobody looked at one another for very long anymore. Hunger had turned entire neighborhoods inward. Johannisplatz appeared through the fog just before 6 o'clock. American military trucks lined the square beneath strings of temporary electric lights that buzzed softly in the cold air. Soldiers moved between folding tables carrying crates stamped with black supply markings. Steam drifted upward from large metal soup kettles near the center of the square. Clara stopped half a block away, suddenly uncertain. Dozens of civilians already stood in line beneath the lights. Women wrapped in blankets. Elderly men with hollow cheeks. Children clutching dented tin bowls against their chests. At the edge of the square, an American guard checked papers before allowing people forward. Clara almost turned around. The memory of the women whispering outside the bakery earlier still lingered heavily in her chest. She could already imagine the rumors spreading through ruined apartment blocks and crowded shelters. The German woman receiving special treatment from an American soldier. Shame moved quickly through occupied cities. But then the smell reached her again. Soup, potatoes, meat broth, real food hot enough to send steam into the freezing air. Clara tightened her grip on the watch inside her pocket and stepped forward. The line moved slowly beneath the glow of hanging lanterns. Somewhere nearby, a radio played low-swing music from inside a military jeep. American voices drifted through the square, calm and ordinary. Men discussing paperwork, cigarettes, coffee. One soldier laughed at something Clara could not hear. The sound startled her more than shouting would have. It had been years since she heard people laugh without fear behind it. When she finally reached the checkpoint table, the guard held out his hand automatically. Clara passed him the folded ration ticket. The soldier unfolded it beneath the lantern light and raised an eyebrow. "Harper gave you this?" he asked. Clara froze. The guard studied her for another second, then glanced toward the far side of the square where several soldiers unloaded crates beside a supply truck. "Go ahead," he said quietly, handing the paper back. "Soup line is straight through." Clara nodded once and stepped into the crowded mess area. Heat rolled from the kettles in soft waves. The smell alone nearly made her dizzy. Potatoes, onion, beef stock, fresh bread stacked in wooden trays nearby beneath white cloth. An American medic moved through the crowd handing out tin cups filled with black coffee to older civilians whose hands shook from cold. Nobody shouted. Nobody pushed. The entire square carried the strange stillness of exhausted people too tired to fight anymore. Clara reached the front of the line and held out her bowl silently. A soldier ladled thick soup into it without looking up. Steam curled around her face immediately. Tiny droplets gathered against her eyelashes. She stepped away from the tables carefully, afraid someone might take the bowl from her before she tasted it. Then she saw Daniel near the supply trucks at the edge of the square. He stood beneath a hanging lantern speaking with another sergeant while marking inventory numbers onto a clipboard. His sleeves were rolled slightly at the wrists now, exposing pale lines where rain and dirt had worn against his skin for months. Clara hesitated before moving closer. Daniel looked up halfway through writing and noticed her instantly. Something softened in his expression when he saw the soup bowl still full in her hands. "Good," he said quietly as she approached. "You made it." Clara looked down at the steam rising between them. "I was not sure I should come." Daniel closed the clipboard and tucked it beneath one arm. "Most people who survive wars learn to stop trusting kindness," he said. "Cannot really blame them for it." For a moment, the square faded around them into lantern light and drifting steam. Clara finally lifted the spoon with trembling fingers and tasted the soup, while Daniel stood beside her in the cold evening air, watching carefully to make sure she ate slowly. The soup was hotter than Clara expected. Steam rose against her face while she stood near the supply trucks beneath the lantern glow, both hands wrapped around the dented tin bowl to keep them warm. The first few spoonfuls hurt slightly going down, not from temperature, but from how long her stomach had gone without real food. Daniel watched carefully without making it obvious. Soldiers who had crossed Europe learned to recognize the signs of starvation the same way farmers recognized weather. Too much food too quickly could break a body already hanging by threads. Around them the square moved with slow evening rhythm. Civilians shuffled through the soup line beneath pale electric lights while American trucks idled nearby, engines rumbling softly in the cold. Somewhere farther down Johannisplatz, somebody played a trumpet badly beside one of the barracks tents. The notes drifted unevenly through the fog like they belonged to another world entirely. Clara lowered the spoon after several careful bites. Heat spread slowly through her chest and hands. For the first time in weeks, the shaking inside her body had eased. Daniel leaned one shoulder against a wooden crate stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and removed his gloves. His hands looked older than the rest of him. Dry skin, small scars across the knuckles, fingertips roughened from cold and machinery and carrying too much weight for too many miles. "Better?" he asked. Clara nodded once. "I forgot soup could smell like this." Daniel gave the faintest smile. Army cooks would probably take that as the highest compliment they ever got. Clara looked down into the bowl again. Potatoes floated beside small pieces of carrot and onion beneath a layer of broth rich enough to leave grease against the spoon. Simple food. Ordinary food. But in 1945, ordinary things had become almost sacred. Nearby, two American soldiers unloaded sacks of flour while speaking quietly to one another. One glanced briefly toward Clara before muttering something under his breath to the other man. She could not hear the words clearly, but she recognized the tone immediately. Curious. Suspicious. Occupied cities survived on rumors the way fires survived on oxygen. Daniel noticed her expression change. "Ignore them," he said calmly. Clara kept her eyes lowered. "They think I am trouble." Daniel folded his gloves carefully before answering. "Most people think strangers are trouble after a war." Wind moved through the square, rattling loose canvas against the supply tents. Clara stared at the lantern reflections trembling across the soup's surface. "My brother used to love potato soup," she said suddenly. The words surprised even her. She had not spoken about family aloud in months. Daniel remained quiet, waiting, before he was sent east. Her voice thinned around the final word. Daniel nodded once. He did not ask what happened afterward. By 1945, soldiers understood silence better than questions. Clara reached into her coat pocket, then, and pulled out the silver watch carefully. The cracked glass caught lantern light across its face. Daniel looked at it again while she wound the small knob gently with trembling fingers. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was faint but steady beneath the distant truck engines and quiet voices. Around them, "Still works," Daniel said. Clara nodded. My father repaired it every Sunday at exactly 6 o'clock. She glanced toward the dark sky above Leipzig. He said if something still keeps time during hard years, you should never throw it away. Daniel looked at the watch for a long moment before speaking softly. Smart man. A military jeep rolled into the square then, tires splashing through shallow puddles beside the mess line. An officer stepped out holding several papers beneath one arm and called for Daniel from across the lantern-lit crowd. Duty returning again. Clara straightened immediately, already preparing to step away before she became an inconvenience. But Daniel paused before turning toward the officer. He reached behind him onto the crate and picked up a folded wool army blanket still wrapped in brown canvas straps. Nights are colder than people expect this time of year, he said, offering it toward her. Clara stared at the blanket in stunned silence. Thick olive wool. Clean. Dry. Something meant for warmth instead of survival. I cannot take this, she whispered. Daniel placed it gently against her arms anyway. Yes, he said quietly. You can. Clara carried the army blanket through Leipzig that night as carefully as if it were made of glass. The wool felt heavy against her arms, thick enough to hold warmth even after the evening air turned sharp with cold. People noticed it immediately. In ruined cities, anything clean stood out. Anything American stood out even more. She kept her eyes lowered while crossing dark streets lined with bombed buildings and broken trolley cables hanging overhead like black wires against the sky. Somewhere nearby, somebody burned wetwood inside a rusted barrel for heat. Smoke drifted low through the alleys. By the time she reached the abandoned rail station near Lindenau, the fog had thickened around the tracks. The station roof remained half-collapsed from earlier air raids, exposing steel beams blackened by weather and years of smoke. Families slept beneath blankets beside old luggage carts and cracked marble columns. Children curled beside mothers beneath coats too thin for spring nights. Nobody spoke. Loudly. Exhaustion had become the natural language of the place. Clara stepped carefully between sleeping bodies until she reached the corner where she usually rested near a boarded ticket window. An older woman looked up immediately when she saw the olive wool blanket folded in Clara's arms. Where did you get that? She whispered. Clara hesitated only a second too long. The woman's expression changed at once. Not anger. Worse. Assumption. Clara sat down without answering and wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Heat settled around her body almost instantly. Real warmth. Not imagined warmth from exhaustion or fever. Around her, cold wind moved through the broken station windows with a low, hollow sound. Clara closed her eyes briefly against the feeling spreading through her chest. Safe. The word returned again from the bakery street that morning. She hated how much comfort it carried now. Across the station, two younger women whispered quietly while glancing toward her corner. One muttered the English word American beneath her breath. Clara pretended not to hear. Shame and survival often arrived together in wartime. Near midnight, she finally fell asleep wrapped in military wool while distant train tracks clicked softly beneath the wind outside. For the first time in weeks, she did not dream about empty shelves or bread lines. Morning arrived gray and cold. Clara woke to the sound of boots crossing cracked tile floors inside the station. American soldiers moved through the building with clipboards and medical satchels, checking names and directing civilians toward relocation centers being established across the city. Some people ignored them entirely. Others followed immediately, desperate for any chance at regular food or shelter. Clara remained seated against the ticket wall with the blanket pulled around her shoulders and the silver watch resting in her hands. Tick, 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 steady as breathing. A young American medic stopped near her corner. Freckles across his nose. Barely older than 20. He pointed toward the blanket. That from Harper? Clara looked up sharply. The medic gave a tired grin. Knew it. He has been stealing supplies for strays since France. Clara frowned slightly. Strays. Kids. Old people. Dogs once. The medic shrugged. Captain keeps threatening paperwork. Harper keeps ignoring him. Clara lowered her eyes toward the watch again. Somewhere beyond the station walls, church bells rang faintly through the fog. The medic glanced around before lowering his voice. He is back at Johannisplatz today if you need another meal ticket. Then he moved on through the station with the other soldiers. Clara sat motionless long after he disappeared. Outside, Wind rattled loose metal signs along the empty street. She looked down at the blanket folded across her lap. American wool. American stitching. A name written faintly along the inside, seam in black marker. Harper. Daniel had given away something that belonged to him personally, not military surplus or extra rations handed out carelessly. Something he probably slept under himself during cold nights crossing Europe. Clara touched the stitched name lightly with her fingertips. Then she looked around the freezing station filled with civilians wrapped in newspapers and threadbare coats. Slowly, without speaking, she stood and carried the blanket toward a sleeping child curled beside his mother near the station wall. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted enough for weak sunlight to spread across Leipzig in pale silver bands. Clara walked back toward Johannisplatz, carrying only the silver watch inside her coat pocket now. The army blanket remained behind at the rail station, wrapped carefully around the sleeping child and his mother. She had left before they woke. Somehow that felt easier. The city looked different in daylight after several proper meals. Not healed, never healed, but sharper somehow. Clara noticed details again. Laundry hanging from shattered balconies. A woman sweeping broken glass from a bakery doorway that no longer had windows. American engineers repairing electrical lines beside a collapsed tram station. Life moving cautiously through ruins. The soup station at Johannisplatz had grown busier since the previous evening. Civilians stood in long lines holding ration cards while military trucks unloaded crates of canned food. Beneath the supervision of exhausted clerks with clipboards, the smell of coffee drifted through the square along with diesel smoke and wet pavement. Clara stopped at the edge of the crowd, searching instinctively for Daniel before realizing how strange that impulse had become. She barely knew him. A soldier from another continent. A man who would eventually leave once occupation duties ended. Yet her eyes searched anyway. She spotted him near the supply tents, helping an older civilian lift a heavy sack of flour from the back of a truck. His sleeves were rolled again despite the cold. Sunlight caught against the faded leather gloves tucked into his belt. He looked up while adjusting the sack onto his shoulder and noticed her immediately across the square. Clara saw surprise flicker briefly across his face. Then concern. Daniel crossed the muddy pavement toward her through the crowd. "Where's the blanket?" he asked the moment he reached her. Clara lowered her eyes slightly. A child needed it more. Daniel stared at her for a second without speaking. Noise moved around them. Truck engines. Ladles striking metal pots. American voices calling inventory numbers. But for a moment Clara heard none of it. Then Daniel exhaled softly through his nose, something close to a tired laugh. "You know," he said, "that was the only dry blanket I had left." Clara's face immediately tightened with embarrassment. "I am sorry. I thought perhaps the army had many." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, I meant." He stopped himself and looked toward the crowded square before continuing quieter. "Most people who are starving keep everything they get. You gave yours away after one night." Clara looked past him toward the civilians lined beside the soup kettles. That boy looked cold. Daniel studied her expression carefully, as if trying to understand something that did not fit the picture he expected. Finally, he nodded once. "Come on." Clara frowned slightly. "Where?" "Coffee." The words sounded almost unreal. Daniel led her toward a smaller tent near the back of the square, where several folding tables stood beneath canvas walls striped with rain stains and military markings. Inside, an American field stove crackled softly beside crates of supplies. The air smelled of coffee grounds and tobacco and damp while drying near heat. A young corporal glanced up from a deck of cards as Daniel entered with Clara behind him. One eyebrow lifted immediately. "Harper," the corporal muttered with a grin. "You adopting civilians now?" Daniel ignored the remark completely. He poured black coffee from a steel kettle into 2 dented tin mugs before handing one carefully to Clara. Steam curled upward between them. Clara wrapped both hands around the warm metal instinctively. Coffee. Real coffee. Bitter and dark and rich enough to make the entire tent smell alive. Daniel leaned against the supply crate beside her. "Drink slow," he said quietly. Clara nodded and lifted the mug carefully. Across the tent, the corporal continued watching them with open curiosity before finally muttering toward another soldier nearby. "Told you Harper would end up bringing home every lost soul in Germany." Daniel took a slow sip from his own mug without looking over. Then, calm as still water, he answered, only the ones everybody else stopped seeing. The coffee tent became the place Clara returned to each evening without admitting to herself that she was returning for Daniel. Outside, Leipzig still looked wounded beneath gray skies and drifting smoke, but inside the canvas walls there was warmth. Lantern light, tin mugs clinking softly against folding tables, American voices rising and falling in tired conversation. For soldiers crossing the final months of the war, the tent was temporary shelter from paperwork and ruined streets. For Clara, it began to feel dangerously close to normal life. 3 days passed that way. Soup lines in the evenings. Coffee beside the field stove afterward. Daniel never asked too many questions. Clara never volunteered many answers. Yet small details gathered between them anyway. He came from Oklahoma. His father repaired tractors during dust storms and hard winters. He hated canned peaches from military rations. He carried a photograph of a brown hunting dog named Walter folded inside his wallet. Clara learned these things slowly, the same way sunlight slowly returned to rooms after years of blackout curtains. In return, Daniel learned that Clara once studied literature before the war swallowed universities and futures alike. That she played piano badly but confidently. That she still wound her father's silver watch every morning at exactly 6, because some habits felt too sacred to abandon. On the 4th evening, rain returned again. Water drummed softly against the canvas roof, while civilians crowded deeper into the soup station outside. Clara sat beside the field stove warming cold hands around black coffee, when voices suddenly rose near the tent entrance. Sharp, irritated. An American military policeman stepped inside, holding a clipboard spotted with rainwater. 2 younger soldiers followed behind him, carrying stacks of relocation forms. "We are clearing non-registered civilians from the supply zone tonight," the policeman announced toward the room. "Orders from headquarters." Several civilians sitting near the stove immediately stood and gathered belongings in silence. Nobody argued with military paperwork anymore. Clara lowered her eyes toward her coffee mug. Her stomach tightened slowly. The policeman moved table to table, checking papers beneath lantern light. Temporary identification cards, relocation stamps, housing assignments. Clara had none. The rail station where she slept was unofficial, invisible on military records. She heard the footsteps stop directly beside her chair. "Papers," the officer said flatly. Clara looked up slowly. Rain tapped against the tent walls. Somewhere outside, truck engines rumbled through puddles. "I do not have any yet," she admitted quietly. The officer sighed through his nose, already exhausted before the conversation began. "Then you need to leave the restricted zone immediately." Clara nodded once and began setting down the coffee mug carefully despite the cold moving through her chest. Before she could stand fully, Daniel's voice cut across the tent. "She stays." The room fell quiet in that strange way military rooms sometimes did when rank and tension collided at once. Daniel stepped away from the supply shelves near the back wall and walked toward them calmly, drying grease from his hands with a cloth rag. The policeman frowned. "Harper, this is not your call." Daniel stopped beside Clara's chair. Lantern light caught the rainwater darkening his sleeves. "She eats here every night. No trouble. No theft. No problems. Orders are orders." "Then put her on my work detail paperwork tomorrow." The policeman looked genuinely confused now. "You're what?" Daniel rested one hand lightly against the back of Clara's chair. "Steady. Certain. She stays with my unit until she is healthy enough to stand in bread lines without collapsing." Silence settled across the tent. Even the corporal playing cards near the stove stopped moving. Clara stared downward at the coffee trembling faintly inside her tin mug. The policeman looked from Daniel to Clara and back again, weighing paperwork against exhaustion and common sense. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and marked a note onto the clipboard. 24 hours, he said sharply. "After that I want documentation." Then he turned and disappeared back into the rain with the other soldiers following behind him. The tent remained silent another few seconds after the flap closed. Daniel exhaled slowly and pulled out the chair across from Clara before sitting down again like nothing unusual had happened. Steam drifted upward between them from the field stove. Clara looked at him carefully across the lantern glow. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Daniel stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. "Because people should not have to beg for permission to stay warm after surviving a war." Weeks passed slowly after that night in the coffee tent. Spring settled over Leipzig in cautious stages. Rubble-strewn streets filled with the sound of hammers and wagon wheels again. Electrical lines flickered back to life across certain neighborhoods. Small markets reopened beneath patched roofs where civilians traded bread, potatoes, cigarettes, and old silverware beneath faded awnings. The city still carried scars everywhere, but life had begun the quiet work of returning. Clara started helping officially at the soup station 3 mornings each week after Daniel arranged temporary paperwork through his unit. She distributed bread beside elderly women from the neighborhood and translated basic instructions between American medics and civilians who spoke little English. At first, the work exhausted her quickly. Some afternoons her hands still shook from weakness while stacking ration tins or carrying water buckets across the square. But little by little strength returned to her body. Color returned to her face. The hollow look around her eyes softened. One morning she caught her reflection in the cracked pharmacy window near Johannisplatz and stopped walking entirely. For the first time in months, she recognized herself. Daniel noticed the change too, though he never mentioned it directly. That was his way. Quiet observations. Quiet kindness. He still drank black coffee from the same dented tin mug every evening beside the field stove. Still carried his leather gloves tucked through his belt. Still checked the silver watch whenever Clara wounded at 6 each morning before the soup lines opened. Your father would approve, he told her once while helping unload flour sacks from a truck. Clara smiled faintly. You did not know my father. Daniel shrugged. Any man who fixed watches during hard times probably understood patience better than most people. By June, the rail station near Lindenau had nearly emptied as civilians moved into temporary housing programs established across the city. Clara received a small room above an old tailor shop restored by occupation workers. The ceiling leaked slightly during heavy rain, and one window refused to close completely, but the room had a bed. A real bed. On the first evening there, she placed only 2 things on the wooden table beside the window. Her father's silver watch, and a small unopened packet of American coffee Daniel had quietly left beside her ration books that morning without explanation. The summer air smelled faintly of cut grass and wet stone drifting through the open window. Down below, children chased one another through the street carrying sticks like toy airplanes while American trucks rolled slowly past nearby shops reopening one by one. The war already felt strangely distant in moments like that. Not gone, never gone, but farther away. Then one evening in late June, Daniel arrived at the soup station carrying folded transfer papers beneath one arm. Clara knew immediately from the look in his eyes before he spoke. Soldiers learned how to recognize departure in one another long before the orders actually came. Munich, he said quietly. 2 days. Clara stood beside the bread crates without answering at first. Around them, civilians moved through the square collecting evening meals while lanterns flickered softly against gathering dusk. Somewhere down the avenue, someone played piano through an open apartment window. Slow, careful notes. Daniel rested his hands against the crate edge. War is ending for everybody now, he said. Clara nodded once. Her fingers tightened around the silver watch inside her coat pocket. Tick, 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 steady as ever. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed a folded photograph worn soft at the corners. Walter the hunting dog sitting proudly beside an old wooden porch somewhere beneath Oklahoma sunlight. He handed it to Clara carefully. Proof America actually exists when all this is over, he said with a tired smile. Clara looked down at the photograph for a long moment before speaking softly. You gave me food when I thought people were finished with kindness. Daniel shook his head once. No, his voice stayed low beneath the lantern light and distant city sounds. I just reminded you that surviving is not the same thing as disappearing. Years later, Clara would still remember that sentence more clearly than the sound of sirens or collapsing buildings or military trucks crossing ruined streets. Because wars taught people how to fear each other. But sometimes, quietly, without speeches or medals or history books noticing at all, one exhausted soldier with worn leather gloves and a cup of black coffee could teach someone how to belong to the world again.